Hello and welcome back to Web Design for Small Business. In this video, part 13, MySQL Setup, we're going to be looking at the MySQL database, which is an open source relational database management system, and setting that up for our website. So, to start, I guess talking a little bit about what SQL or SQL is. Initially, it was called SEQUEL, or Structured English Query Language, which, due to trademark infractions, was then shortened to just Structured Query Language and SQL. So you might hear it being called the initialism SQL or the acronym SQL. Both are correct. Now, MySQL or MySQL is a fork of that main branch, and it's basically free and open source and one of the most popular and widely used databases for web design. And that's what we're going to be using. Now, if you have the same host that we do, or another one, hopefully you do have MySQL on yours, you might have a different database. If you look at ours, it has both the MySQL and PostgreSQL. Now, they do differ slightly, but most of these are fairly similar when it comes to working with them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go into our cPanel and scroll down until you find the Databases section. There you should find a button that says MySQL Database Wizard. Click on that link. Now, the first step will be create a database. So it will put your username and an underscore in front of it. If it doesn't do that, you probably have a dedicated server, but since we're on a shared server, it's going to give us a prefix of our username for all of our databases that we create. And I'm simply going to call this Highway 45. In the next step, we have to create a user to access this. And I'm just going to call it Highway 45 Admin. And type in a password. And create that user. And now it'll ask you, before it adds it to the database, what privileges we want to give it. And just check the All Privileges box, which will check everything else, and hit Next Step. And that step is done. So now we can actually go into that. If we go back to the main control panel now, this phpMyAdmin is the primary way of accessing your database directly through cPanel. This software is very common, very popular, so most web hosts will actually use that exact software. We will use it to set up our tables. So what is a database? Think of it as, for example, a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. It's literally just a table with different titles and rows and columns with values entered in. It is just literally that table of data. However, we can access it and edit it through PHP code on our site. So this is how we're going to store a bulk of the information. Clicking on phpMyAdmin, it will take a minute to redirect. And then you'll see it in the list on the side. And just click on it. I'm going to move that and just full screen this so that I don't have to bother trying to censor out all the rest of my sensitive information. Okay, so under structure, no tables found in database, create table. So we are going to create a few different tables. The first one, and it says number of columns, that doesn't matter, leave it at whatever the default is. We can add and remove columns as we need to. So the first thing we're going to do is create one called users. Or in this case, I'm actually going to call it customers. You can call this whatever you want, but basically these are going to be our login information. So in the case of this site where it's a restaurant, we're going to have all of our customer information stored in this table. Hit go, and it'll bring us to another page that will ask us to enter in our columns. So the first one is just going to be ID, the type, and there's a whole lot here. Basically, under numeric, you're going to have a bunch of different integers. The main thing to note here is that they have different default min and maxes, which if you hover over it will actually tell you that range. But they are all basically just integers. Decimal allows to have a decimal place. Float, double, real, rarely ever use any of those. Boolean, if you use a Boolean, it actually just converts it to tiny int 1. Tiny int with a value of 1 basically just means that it can be, it's an integer of 1 character. So it isn't actually just 0 or 1, which is what a Boolean would be, but it can be 0 through 9. Blobs and text, these texts are all just different forms of strings, basically meaning it can take any character. And then the last one, there's dates. So date and time. Date is simply just year, month, day, and date, time, and timestamp both also include a time as well as the date. And I think the only other one I'm trying to find to tell you about, I can't actually see it, but it is called set. I guess serial, which is the one we're going to select for our ID, basically just gives you the largest integer you can get, and it's designed for ID numbers and stuff like that. So so set, there we go. A set is basically an array of predetermined answers. So think of it as a drop-down list with multiple choice answers. So it has to be one of those that you set, and it can be any of them, but you choose what they are. So instead of text, for example, where it can literally be any string of characters, we're forcing it to be certain things that are text-based, but it has to be one of those, if that makes sense. Okay, so the first one, ID, is a serial. Then we're going to do fname, and that's going to be text, or tiny text, sorry. And if you're wondering what's the point in doing tiny text as opposed to just text, tiny text allows fewer characters, which just means that it's going to take up less space on the server overall. And that's really just it. It prevents people from being able to type in a whole lot. Okay, so fname and lname, so we got the first name, the last name. I'm going to do a phone, so the customer's phone number. And this is also going to be tiny text. So that way we can include special characters. If it was just an integer, it couldn't, and if you had preceding zeros and such, you might get issues, so keeping it as a string is best. Now you notice that we used all 4, but I want to do some more. So up at the top here, we can add columns, and I'm going to add 4 more columns. Hit go. The next one is going to be email. And again, that's going to be a tiny text. The next one is going to be address 1, address 2, city, province, country, postal code, or just PC. So again, these are all going to be tiny text. If you notice, I'm not actually looking for it in the drop down. I'm clicking on it and then I'm typing in tiny text. If you type it fast enough, it will actually go to it. If you type it too slowly or do a typo, you'll have to start over and it might not actually find it. And then you'll have to manually search for it. Okay. So now the length or value is basically going to be the maximum number of characters that you will allow for that. So with tiny text, it already has a limit, so we could further reduce that, but I'm not going to. The default is basically if you set as defined for the default, it will actually set this as a value, so you can choose a default value for it. If you set null or none, it will just leave it blank by default. So we're just going to leave those all as none. Collation, you can set them individually. We're going to use this one here, which will set them all the same, and that is actually going to be UTF-8. And attributes, binary, unsigned, unsigned, zero filled, or on update current timestamp. That last one is just for timestamps. Unsigned and unsigned zero filled basically means it's 4 numbers, and it's whether or not the number can be negative or if it has to be a positive. And the zero fill means that it has a, so if, for example, it has 16 characters and you have the number 1, it would have 15 zeros in front of it. The null checkbox is basically if you want the value to, or if you want to be able to include a null value for it. Index is basically designed for IDs and stuff like that. AI is auto increment, so that would be set for serial, but when we select this as serial instead of doing an integer, it will automatically use that stuff for us. So really none of this stuff I have to worry about. The only other thing down here that I want is this storage engine. By default on this one, it's MyISAM, and I actually want to change that to InnoDB. These are all different types of storage engines that you can use with MySQL. CSV is comma separated values. InnoDB is probably one of the advanced ones, and it's a lot faster in my experience, and really it makes it as good as some of the more modern databases that aren't MySQL. So having that set as InnoDB basically future proofs it for any issues you might have. So I always choose that one when it's possible. So we're going to save that. And it's going to take a minute to process. All right. So now we have a browse section and a structure. So the structure, where we were before, will have so the browse section will have it listed with our table with basically those column headers at the top, and then actually give us a list of all of our different entered data. So if you actually have users, they would all show up in a list here. Under structure, you basically see these columns set as a column themselves, and in a table basically defining what they are as we set them up, so you can actually go in and change these if need be. So if you decide that you want the phone number to be an integer, you could change that to an integer. Things like that. Okay, so now we go back up here. So we're right now in our table customers. We want to go back to our database. And now you'll see under structure, we have our one table. And we want to create a new table. And this one I'm going to call menu. And I'm just going to pump up the number of columns a couple times. All right. So same thing here. We're changing the collation to UTF-8 and the storage engine to InnoDB. And in here, I'm going to give this an ID again. That's going to be a serial. The next one is going to be the name, price, flags, category, and I think that might be it. Oh. I'll do a description, and I'm going to add one more. And call it image. Okay. So the name is going to be tiny text. The price is going to be a decimal. And that's going to be 6, 2. make sure I have that formatting right. It'll tell me if it doesn't like it. I might have to put it in brackets, but basically the comma delineates the decimal point. So how many digits are allowed before the decimal, how many are allowed after, and I'm just going to do 6 and 2. It really could probably be 2 and 2, but not a big deal. And flags are going to be tiny text. Category, tiny text. Now the category I could actually set as a set, so I might do that just to show what that's going to be. So we use single quotes here, and in the quotes we just type in what our different sets are. So I could do appetizers, soup, fried rice, and so on and so forth. However, because I'm going to have a lot, and because it would actually take more work to list them all here than to just have it be able to choose any one I want and then just have to know what they are, I'm not actually going to list them here and force it. So I'm just going to do tiny text. But if you had a set and wanted to do it that way, that's how you would do it. One advantage to doing it that way is that if you do decide to use the sets, and you decide to actually edit all of your database information directly through this process, when you're editing those, it would give you a drop-down menu instead of having to type it in. So if you're going to be using phpMyAdmin to edit your database all the time, that is going to work for you. But we're actually going to create a backend PHP service to do that. So we'll have a fancy UI to use instead of having to do it through this. Description, I'm going to go with text so that it can actually be bigger. And image is going to be tiny text because that's actually just going to be a URL for where the image is located. Okay, double check all that. And this is basically our menu. So an ID number so that it can find it in the system easily and catalog it. So something always has to be unique. So it's always nice to have an ID number that can auto increment and you don't really have to worry about it. The name of the product, or the name of the food in this case, the menu thing. Description if you want a little blurb about what it is. An image if you want to add a picture of the food. Flags, so you could do things like hot or vegetarian or contains gluten, stuff like that. You can add little flags to it automatically. And then obviously the price. So yeah, that's what those fields are. And if you're doing products of some kind, really anything like this would work. You can have more or less. It doesn't really matter. It's completely up to you what you want to use. So save that. Okay, and then we're going to add one more. So yeah, once we create it, it automatically opens that one up for us. So we're going to go up here, back to our database, and add one more. And this one we're going to call orders. So if we want to be able to do online ordering, just thought of something I'm going to add to the last one, but for now, let's focus on what we're doing here. So that's going to be a serial again. This is going to be a customer. And we're going to just keep that at int, possibly do it as a big int, because serial uses big int, and it's just the size of the integer that's allowed. We could in fact go and add the unsigned attribute, which means that it can only be a positive number. All right, so we have customer. Items, this is going to be text. Now the reason for this is because this is actually going to be a kind of faked array. So what we're going to have in this items list is the ID numbers of the menu items that they're ordering, separated by commas. And we're going to have status, and this is going to be a set, and paid, unpaid, I'm going to change this one to payment. Actually, I'm just going to change it to paid and have that as a Boolean. So that is a type in bool, and it would just change it to a tiny text of 1. Okay, and I'm going to add 3 more rows, sorry, columns. Okay, so status. So I'll do a set for this one, because I was thinking, for paid, we just need to know basically, have they paid, have they not paid, right? So if it's been prepaid, like they paid online, then the staff knows that they have to pay when they come in to pick it up. If they didn't pay, and then basically if they pay when they come in, then they can change it to paid once it's been completed, so they have a list of everything that's been paid and hasn't been paid. So really you just need to know the two methods. You could further break it down into a payment method. Pay method, and actually that's what I'm going to do. Cash, credit, debit. And depending on how you track your credit cards, you might want to have Visa and MasterCard as separate values. You can do that, it doesn't really matter. And then we're also going to check null for this one and default as null. I don't know how null actually works with sets. It might screw everything up, but hey, that's fine. Okay, so status set. So this is ordered. So wait, sent, received, preparing, and ready. And complete. Completed. Okay, so this, I just had an inspiring moment. The order status. So basically, clients would be able to actually track the status of their order. So basically, as soon as they create the order, it marks it as sent, so they know that it successfully went through. Once it has been received, so once it's been acknowledged that the order has come in, it gets marked as received. Once they start cooking the order, it would go to preparing. Once it's done and ready for pickup, it would be marked as ready, and then once it has been picked up, it goes to completed. And basically at that point would get dumped out of the system for the back end. All right. That's supposed to have a Y in it. All right, so we have customers, items, payment status. And ordered. And this is a timestamp. And default is current timestamp. Now you can only have one timestamp per table. So, yeah. But the nice thing is you can have it by default set to the current timestamp, so you don't actually have to go through and double check the time each time. Yeah. Okay, so we check when it was ordered. And just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yep, that should be fine. So I don't need that last space. So if I just leave it blank, it'll just get rid of it for me when I save. So I'm going to save that, and if I ever want to go back and add anything, I can. That's not a big deal. Okay, and I was thinking of going back into the menu and adding something there, so I'm going to open up my menu. It might still be trying to load this back in, which it did, and now it's going back. Okay. So yes, we're on menu now, and go into structure. Okay, and I'm going to add a column after image, after category. So you can place it anywhere within there that you want, and you can actually move them around. This move columns will allow you to adjust which column fits in which space, if you want them to line up differently. In all honesty, it doesn't really matter what order the columns are in. You can have them view in any order you want. Okay, so this column was, oh yeah, items and text. Collation, UTF-8. Because I'm adding this one separately, I don't have to worry about using InnoDB because that's only set once for the table. You can also set what the default is, but we didn't, so the default is going to be, I think it's Swedish or something like that. And if you want to check that, I believe it's in operations. And the collation there. So yeah, oh yeah, because we set that initially, that's right. The default one for the table, or for the database, because I know the storage engine by default, it isn't. Yeah, see, it's MySQL Latin 1 Swedish. So this Latin 1 Swedish, we can change that to UTF-8 right there. And you can set it to change everything to it if something is not. But changing the default database type, I honestly don't know where to do that, so I've just never bothered. Alright. So, we have those three databases now created, and that's really all we need to do in here. So I will close this tab out. Okay, so now we go back to our main control panel, and we go into File Manager, and in our File Manager we are going to create a new folder. So click on the new folder button, enter the name of a new folder. I hit the X by accident. So basically, by default, you should have your web folder. It might be something like public HTML, or in our case, it's Highway 45, like that. And what we want to do is we want to create a new folder that's not in that folder, so it's not a subfolder, which is why if it was, we just create it here in NetBeans by adding a folder, but we want something that exists beside this and not under it, if that makes sense. So we want to create a new folder, and it can be called safe, secure, private. You can call it orange juice. It really doesn't matter. Just something that you know what the name is so that you can find it later. But this is where we're going to keep our secured information, because we're keeping it outside of the web root. So basically there's no way to directly access it from the browser when accessing our site. Because PHP runs off the server, PHP doesn't actually call for files from the URLs like HTML and JavaScript does, that we've been working with so far. They can actually access the files directly from the server, and thus we don't need to have it in the web root. and if we have any files that we want to be secure or more secure, having them outside the web root means that you can't just download the file and look at it. So anything where we need to put passwords or encryption information, we can store outside of that, and it just makes it significantly more secure. So I'm creating that folder. It gives me an error message because I've already created it, so that's not a problem. So once you get to your folder, it'll be empty, and we're going to create a file in our new folder. And the first file that I'm going to create is going to be called connect.php. And create new file. And select that and edit it. Now, because we're creating these files on a directory that we can't access through our normal methods, we can't actually connect to it with NetBeans. Now, you can, if you want, create a separate FTP access to directly access that folder, and then it would come up as kind of a separate project you could add in here. The problem is then you're opening up an FTP connection to your secure folder, making it that much less secure. So I don't recommend doing that. We want to have as minimal access to it as possible because you have to be able to access everything through cPanel. Having that as our sole point of access is the safest way. So UTF-8, edit. Okay. So, like all PHP pages, we start with our PHP code. And for this one, we are going to create a comment and MySQL connection, just so that we label it so we know what we're doing here. Okay, and we're going to call this Highway 45 host. Highway 45 user. And you notice I'm just creating some variables, but I'm not actually setting them as anything. So just the name and then a semicolon to go to the next one. Basically just creating null valued variables. And highway 45 pass. And highway 45 name. Okay, let's now go back into these. Backspace. I'm going to tab these out. Okay. So the host, it should just be localhost. Sorry, I'm going to use single quotes. So localhost, all one word. Now, if it's not that, which it should be because we're directly accessing our server, you may need to contact your hosting provider to find out what you'd need to use to set that up. But try localhost first because that's almost always what it's going to be or what's going to work for it. Now for the username, this was the database username that we created, and you have to keep in mind that it's going to have your host username and an underscore as a prefix. So in my case, it's amazingb underscore highway 45 phpMyAdmin. Password. And I'm going to leave that blank and edit it off screen because I'm not going to give away my password. And then the name is the name of the database itself, which again has that same prefix. 5. Okay, so we save changes to that and close. Okay. So that file is done. The next one is going to be what to do. Okay, our core file. Now you can name it whatever you want to name it. It can be as elusive as you want. You can call it functions, engine, core, really whatever you want to call it. I typically just call it core so that I know what I'm doing. So core.php. And we're going to edit that one. Okay, and again, starting with our PHP, ending with PHP, and the first two are going to be some PHP functions that deal with localization, or basically your local date and time type things. So set locale. And LC underscore all, comma, and then your 2-digit country code. So for me, it's going to be CA. And then date default time zone set. Now for this one, it basically, your server is going to have a time zone set by default to wherever the server is located. So if you want your entire website and all the information on it using timestamps for a different time zone than what you're in, is going to make things a little awkward because you always have to account for that time difference. This becomes even more complex when you start dealing with daylight savings time. So the easiest way I found is to basically, if you are a local company, set it for your local time. If you are a larger company and you have multiple locations, set it for the main office. That just kind of works easier. So in this case, for all cases, this list here at php.net/manual/en for English /timezones.php. If English is not your language, you can change that en to anything else, or there's this drop down here, change language, which will just probably change that. And then you get this list here. Select your continent, so going to America for us, and then choosing one of these. Basically, you're looking for the city that is closest to you. And in my case, being in Alberta, America /Edmonton. Edmonton being the capital city of Alberta. So that's the one I'm going to use. And it's just like that. So in single quotes within those parentheses, America with a capital A / Edmonton with a capital E. and this will give us the Mountain Standard Time as our default time zone for everything that we do. Okay. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a require statement. So, require, I'm going to briefly go over. Sorry, you don't actually need those brackets. You can just use the quotes. So, you can do either include or require to include another PHP file into this PHP file. So what we're going to include here is our connect file that we had just created. So that file will actually be embedded into this file in this location. So basically the way that works in a hierarchy is when we load this file, so this file will actually be included in another file that we create. So when it pulls that one up, it will read this line, then this line, and then it'll require the next file. So it'll take our connect and read all the lines in that and then continue on. Now, the difference between require and include is that requires means that it is mandatory. So if you have require and the file does not exist, it will exit the script with an error message. If you have include and the file does not exist, it will ignore it and move on. So if you are dealing with temporary files that may or may not exist, use include. So that way, if the file doesn't exist, you don't get an error message. It just doesn't give you the information and you can move on. If it's something that you need in order for the script to function properly, then use require, and that way it'll give you an error message if it doesn't work, so that you can help figure out what went wrong and fix it. Now, beyond include and require, there's also include once and require once. The difference there is that if throughout a long script you have multiple instances where you need a specific file and you're not sure if it's already been called, if you hit require multiple times, that file is going to be loaded multiple times and will start to overwrite itself and cause errors. So having require once means that if it's been required before, don't require it again. So that's handy if you know you're going to be adding multiple files or the same file multiple times in different spaces. Using require once will prevent that overwriting. But we know we're just going to use it the one time. Now the format, normally we would do the https://, but in this case we're actually using the local address on the server. So it's a set of double forward slashes and home slash the, and this is true for our host. It might be different for your host, but this is usually how it's set up, and it would be set up this way within the file manager. So up at the top here, this is what we're looking for, but we're just adding an extra forward slash at the beginning. So home amazing B, slash secure slash highway 45, and then connect.php. So this file is now included in, or the last file that we created, the connect file, is now included in this one. So we don't actually have to require this connect file in anything else, because anything that we would need this for will be requiring this core file instead. So basically all the files that we create in the secure section will all be included in this core file, which we will then just link back to. Okay, so we're going to go through and add more that we haven't actually created yet. Now, the reason why so encryption and key, very basic. We're going to create a security algorithm and put it in our encryption one, and then the passwords that we have for anything are going to be stored in the key section. The reason why I separate those is the same reason why you wouldn't want to keep a lock and the key side by side. It's very insecure. If they get one, they get everything. In this case, they would have to find both files in order to be able to use them, because just the key by itself or just the encryption file by itself don't do anything. You need both in order to make them work together. So keeping things separate is just slightly more secure. Obviously, if they have access to one, they'll have access to the other, but it's one more step. Alright, so the next thing we're doing, and why I left a space here, is before we do those ones, we want to do something with this, and that is connect to our database. So we are going to go highway 45 dB is the variable I'm going to give to our database, and MySQLi underscore connect parentheses semicolon. In the parentheses, we are going to add all of the things that we had listed before in the order that we put them in. So highway 45 host, comma, highway 45 user, highway 45 pass, and highway 45 name. Alright. So basically it's creating a new connection using the information that we've given it. So connect to that host, so that server, using that username and password combination, and open up that database. And that's where I'm going to leave you for this video. In our next video, we're going to continue working with this core file by creating the encryption algorithms that we're going to be using throughout the site, as well as creating our key file, and then linking those back to our main site in NetBeans. And I guess I will see you guys in the next video.